Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm your host, Kendra Cordova, and today we're going to analyze the first chapter of Dr. Kuggle's Homosexuality in Islam, Critical Reflections on Gay, Lesbian, and Transgender Muslims. So, Dr. Kuggle is a professor of Islamic, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Studies at Emory University. He has a PhD in History of Religions, and he was previously a research scholar at the Henry Martin Institute for Islamic Studies, Interreligious Dialogue, and Conflict Resolution in Hyderabad, India. So, this is a topic that he has studied in depth. This is a pretty hefty book, so we're going to go one chapter at a time. So, if you are looking, though, for a progressive interpretation and a breakdown of a logical analysis of the story of Lut, that is actually going to be in our previous video called Gay and Muslim. So go check out that one if that's what you're looking for. This one specifically is just going to be an analysis and a sharing of some of the key points here within the first chapter of this amazing scholarly work. These videos present a progressive interpretation, and as we're working through these, one of the big things that we are going to be doing is going to be pushing against and pushing past some of these logical fallacies that come up in dialogue and rhetoric around these kind of topics. The biggest one here that is often brought up is this logical fallacy called ad populum. So ad populum means that, well, the majority of people agree with this interpretation, therefore it is true. Now that is a logical fallacy, and a great example of why that can be a logical fallacy is that a lot of people agreeing on something doesn't prove fact. Great examples of this are going to be that, like, everybody used to believe that the world was flat or that the earth was the center of our solar system, to the point that they actually would kill scientists who believed otherwise, right? But of course it was proven through science, through logic, that the majority population opinion was actually incorrect. So using the idea that a lot of people believe one certain way and therefore it is the only truth, it's the only way, and it is like fact, nobody should argue against it for the reason that everybody agrees on it, is actually a logical fallacy. I'm going to have a separate video later with you guys. I'd love to share about a long list of logical fallacies that progressive Muslims often run into, and also some thought-stopping cliches, so that we can work through and we can think through and come to a more holistic and open-hearted, open-minded conversation about these topics. So let's get into this though. So chapter 1 is called Islam on Trial. And in this chapter, Dr. Kuggle describes for us his experience with actually having to go and testify at a trial, an immigration trial for a young man who was seeking asylum here in the United States. And he calls him Mehdi. That's a fake name to keep his identity safe. So Mehdi is recounting sort of why he is seeking asylum for fear of being tortured or killed if he is to return to Morocco, which is where he is from, on the basis of him being a homosexual. So Dr. Kuggle recounts Mehdi's story, and it's very abusive. Some of the stuff that he talks about too is that not only does Mehdi face abuses, but Mehdi was around and experienced getting to see other abuses done to queer people in Morocco, including honor killings, like a girl who was killed by her own family, and the police often turning a blind eye to this kind of abuse. This put Dr. Kuggle in kind of a really difficult position. And this is a difficult position that progressive Muslims also face. I do see some people in the comments and some people who message me and try to contact me, letting me know that they also struggle with some of this, whereas they are very progressive in their mindset, right? And in their worldview and in the way that they want to help the oppressed and all of this. And they say that they connect so strongly with the Quran because of this, as many Muslims do, but that they get very confused and concerned when they face a lot of backlash about their progressive views, which they feel are very strongly rooted in Islam itself. So Dr. Kuggle talks about how this put him in a difficult position because his interpretation and practice and the way he teaches Islam and has studied it for years, it's very progressive and it's very close to his heart. But then on the other hand, he had to, in front of a court, admit that the way that Islam is practiced in Morocco does include prejudice toward homosexuals, sometimes violent, expose Mehdi to human rights violations and even death. But instead of this causing Dr. Kuggle to sign off on Islam altogether and say, well, maybe this is just the way it is, maybe I've got it all wrong, he knows that he is an expert in this area, and he wanted to take the time to put this book together to share his logic, share his analysis, share how he got to where he got to through his study of Islamic jurisprudence and things of that sort. So while of course this example is technically anecdotal, Dr. Kuggle does say that this experience gave him the time to reflect on some of these topics in greater depth, and it was what inspired him to write this book. So let's talk about 5 key takeaways from this chapter specifically. The first one I want to talk about because it connects back to the video that we just did, Gay and Muslim, right? Where we broke down the story of Lut and his people and how the homosexual acts that were specifically talked about and condemned are this form of homosexual rape. This using it as violence against other people who you disagree with or don't like, or who are not of your people, right? In the first chapter, he recounts he has learned about and studied and interviewed and talked to people in Morocco who have experienced some of the trauma that goes on in the legal system for homosexuals. And one of the main things that he noted here is that in the prison systems and with the police and people who are in charge and in the jails, there's often rape. There's often rape and sexual abuse towards homosexuals by their captors. Sometimes they will even rent out homosexuals to each other to abuse in these legal systems, which I wanted to point out that while we were able to show that homosexuality as a blanket is not what was talked about in the story of Lut and what was condemned, that these people who think that mistreating and having this prejudice and this anger and this hate towards homosexuals and punishing them is what God wanted. It's also really interesting to note that one of the ways they end up going about doing that is actually by embodying the thing itself that Allah said was condemned and awful here, and that is homosexual rape and abuse in that way. So it's really interesting that the people who are in charge of that end up embodying and becoming and acting out the very thing that they claim to hate so much. I found that very ironic. So that's an interesting thing to note, but it's also important to notice that and acknowledge that these things happen, and these are major human rights violations. But let's talk about Islam itself. And let's talk about some of the other takeaways we can get from this, not just in a negative light, but just in general as far as Islam and homosexuality go. So I want to talk about, so number 2, I want to talk about how Islam isn't a monolith and that it doesn't speak for itself. So he has a wonderful paragraph here, which talks about the whole question when people say, well, what does Islam say about this? What does Islam say about that? Islam doesn't speak for itself. Islam is like this combination of the Quran, Hadith and Sunnah, cultural traditions, scholarly analysis, lifestyles, and basically it is different based on who is the one experiencing it, who is the one reading it and analyzing it and living it. This is why when you go around the world and you see different Muslim cultures, they might look a little different, right? There are some things that are like set in stone, right, that are across the board Islamic. But after you branch out from some of those, so first, it's that there's only one God, and that, prayer is zakat, that the Quran is the word of God, that, Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the prophet of God. After you get past those things, some of the more abstract or nuanced things are different, depending on who's reading it, experiencing it, living it, teaching it. And so this, you can't really say that Islam speaks about these things in a certain way because Islam doesn't, the people do. So Here's his direct quote from this paragraph. He says, the case raises important questions about how Islam, as a religious tradition, treats homosexuality, or more exactly, how Muslims, as religious agents, treat homosexual women and men in a systematically negative way that could be categorized as an infringement of their inalienable human rights. The seemingly simple question, what does Islam say about homosexuality, homosexuals, is not easy to answer. Islam, after all, has no voice. Only Muslims have voices. Only they speak in the name of Islam, and Muslims speak from distinct social and political contexts that shape how they practice and represent their religious tradition. Islam's a complex tradition with many variations, internal contradictions, and creative ambiguities. This is true even if those who discuss homosexuality do not normally admit any ambiguity or variation, whether condemning homosexuals or protecting them. I was called to testify in the court hearing to clarify the nature of Islam, its stance on homosexuality, and variations in Islamic practice among Moroccan Muslims. So, as you see here, only Muslims have voices, right? The way that Islam is practiced in the world is actually because of the people that are practicing it and their interpretation, their cultural and political views, etc. I thought that was a really interesting way of putting that, because a lot of people who aren't Muslim do believe that all Muslims are exactly the same and that Islam is a monolith. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, that's not really true at all. Outside of the very basic tenets that I just noted that are the same across the board, everything else then starts to have its own fluid interpretation. Number 3 I want to talk about is kind of echoes back on that, and that's that there are actually very few rulings in Islam that are the same across the board. Many of these rulings are outdated or lack modern logical analysis. When you talk to Muslims, one of the first branches you're going to get is Sunni, Shia, Sufi, etc. And then the branch after that's going to happen is going to be, which school of thought do you follow? And that's because the different schools of thought have a different way of analyzing and contextualizing the Sharia. And so they're going to come up with different answers to the questions that are posed by Muslims around the world. So he says here, however, the full context of Islamic legal rulings is far more complicated. They are based upon the Quran and Hadith, but were deduced from these texts through a process of rational analogy shaped by cultural assumptions and political expedience over a 3-century-long process. Both Sunni and Shia orthodoxies represent the cumulative collection of legal decisions, the Sharia, as the immutable expressions of God's will based on the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's directives. Behind the representation, however, lies the fact that the Sharia encompasses diversity between different interpretations as well as disagreement on the details of rulings and debate about the principles of deducing rulings themselves. Far from the monolithic facade that neo-traditionalists present, Islamic law of the classical period provides varied rulings about homosexual acts which embody deep and unresolved differences of opinion, as we will explore in Chapter 4. In addition, Islamic law is rarely applied directly in modern nation-states with a Muslim majority. Most nation-states with a Muslim majority enforce legal systems based on parliamentary legislation, autocratic command, a bureaucratic protocol. Their rules and laws may be influenced by Islamic custom or ethics, but cannot realistically be said to enforce the Sharia in its classical form. It's not an exact science. We're talking about analyzing texts, having to contextualize them throughout time, having to decide what is relevant, what is not relevant, how this ambiguous sort of clip of like a surah or an ayah or a hadith, how it can be applied today and how it's been applied in the past and what that has to do with the people that are experiencing it right now. There's a lot that goes into this, and the different schools of thought, even though people like to believe, like I said, that Islam is just this monolith where everybody follows the exact same checklist and is exactly the same all the time. It's actually different than that, right? It's actually more creative than that. And I found that section there a really interesting way to put all of that. Number 4, I want to talk about how he, throughout this book, says he's going to be drawing scholarly inspiration from Ibn Hazm. So Ibn Hazm is an 11th century scholar. He talks about the importance of testing ideas and questioning common consensus and rulings. So a lot of people also like to say that like early Muslims from like the first 1,000 years or so, first 600 years or so, whatever, were, again, very strict, always exactly the same. And if we're going to go back to the traditional way, then we are going to have to do it in this very extreme, strict, harsh manner, right? So there are some little sections here I noted on Ibn Hazm, for those who haven't heard of him, and sort of like how this mentality and Islamic living, this Islamic scholarly style, can help us as we go forward in these videos and as we go through all these different texts together. So here he says, Ibn Hazm was an interpreter of the Quran who was quite sensitive to issues of gender and sexuality and was relentless in exploring the contradictions in his community's conclusions about the sacred text. For instance, he held that women could be prophets and upheld his opinion in detailed readings of the Quran itself, even though most in his patriarchal society believed that women were inherently inferior to men in physique, in reason, and in piety, and therefore God would never entrust to women the authority of bearing divine messages to humanity. So again, ad populum doesn't prove that something is correct. And here, this scholar pointed that out, that it might not be a popular opinion, but he was able to derive his opinions and his views and his conclusions from the Quran itself. On such delicate issues, he outspokenly assessed the community's differences of opinion, both theological and legal, and critiqued any drive to close down debate. For instance, Ibn Hazm believed that homosexual acts were a crime, but totally disagreed with other Muslim jurists about the reason why this was so and the rationale for the penalties such acts incurred. He asserts that the punishment for homosexual acts as a crime is not based upon the Quran. This book will address his legal opinions in detail in chapter 4. His is an important but subtle argument that urges us now, almost 1,000 years after his lifetime, to reassess popular notions in Muslim communities about the acceptability of gay, lesbian, and transgender believers in their midst and at their margins. Above and beyond his specific legal rulings or scriptural interpretations, Ibn Hazm acknowledged that love is love, whether it's hetero or homosexual in orientation. He was an avid fan of love poetry and acknowledged that much of the best poetry was written by Muslims, was homoerotic, addressed by male poets to a beloved who is also male. Concerning the sins and faults which emerge from physical temptations and which inhabit faith and doctrine, we find that Ibn Hazm is tolerant and forgiving. As Ibn Hazm demonstrates, many Muslim authors, ethicists, and intellectuals saw hetero and homoerotic love as being equally love. Both approaches were valuable as love, and both were potentially a spiritual training ground for loving God. This is an issue they considered independently from whether specific acts were legal or illegal. There's one more paragraph after this, but I just want to stop here for a sec and say, okay, so what we're seeing here is that even all the way down, or all the way back to the 11th century, we're seeing a difference in opinion and questions, and scholars that might, like if a scholar said this kind of stuff today, might face a lot of backlash, right? Saying that they were just being too modern or being too progressive or being too Western or being too this and that. But this guy was in like, the 1000s, right? Like, this was a while ago. This isn't new. These concepts and conversations and topics were brought up even far back and earlier in Islamic history. So here's the last paragraph for the specific part I want to share with you. It says, he eagerly probed the consensus of his Islamic community, testing their arguments against the touchstone of research and fearlessly raising objections to the conclusions of common piety and chauvinistic self-righteousness. In his era, when holding slaves was common and legal, he defended their inherent human rights. In his society, which was a kingdom based on aristocratic privilege, he argued that the state should provide all people free education. He also argued that Islam must be practiced in accord with scientific observation and disciplined reason, calling upon the resource of logic and philosophy. In his world-embracing optimism, he saw all knowledge, whether it came from sacred or secular disciplines of learning, as leading to a greater knowledge of God and a greater appreciation of divine wisdom in the perpetual creation and recreation of the world in which we live. This is what we talked about in the previous videos on a progressive mindset, right? It's that the more we learn, the more we know God, and the more we know God, the better we can live for God, right? And that's in here, and I love it. Definitely look into more of those writings if you haven't already. And so finally, let's come around to number 5, the last thing that I wanted to talk about here. And this, he talks about the reason why he wrote this book, and this is sort of the reason and the why behind the videos that we're doing and what we're going to create on this channel as we continue to talk about these topics. Looking at these research, looking at these different books on the topics, looking at some of the interviews we're going to do and stories we're going to share of queer Muslims around the world. He says, Mehdi's story also reveals to us how homosexuals in Muslim communities are silenced by shame and never given an opportunity to rationally discuss their sexuality, openly interpret their own religion, or express their own sense of morality based on their experience of faith. Like, queer Muslims are not often given the microphone. They're not often given, like, what has been your experience? What do you love about Islam? What is it like for you? What is your thought process? What is your experience of God? Silenced so that they can't share their voices, and sometimes even abused physically or even killed. And not just by random strangers that are angry at them, but people in their family, people in their friend circle, people who if anybody was ever going to give them that microphone, anybody was ever going to show them love and love them as God's creation, it would have been them. So as we go through, we're going to hand that mic off. We're going to take a look at some of these, like I said, scholarly analysis, and then from there we're going to branch off into doing some interviews with progressive Muslims around the world. If you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe. We're going to go to chapter 2, and we're also going to break down some other writings of Dr. Kuggle's before we move on to some of the other authors here and get some of those interviews in. And if you're looking for a great place to put your zakat money that you know is going to help progressive Muslims around the world, help women's rights, queer rights, just general human healing here, especially in Islamic lands, Muslims for Progressive Values is that place. MPV is a nonprofit that is actually partnered with the United Nations in helping people around the world, helping train imams in progressive thought, to help them uphold the rights of women, and other marginalized groups of people. So we're going to have more videos soon, inshallah. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.